Okay, good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're located. This is Tim Gunther from Power Details. I first want to extend my thanks to you guys for joining on a Friday and being a part of this discussion. Power Details is privileged to host Attorney Eric Daigle, Daigle Law Group, to discuss the topic of legal aspects of secondary employment, or what some of you may know as off-duty details. We were not sure when I started talking, Andy Rivera and I and Ryan from Power Details started talking to Eric about this. We weren't sure the response we'd get, and we were quite happy that we had over 400 departments registered for this event, which tells us we're providing you information on a topic of importance. Power Details is committed to providing education and tools to help your department understand and manage the secondary employment area. I've personally known Eric for several years, and I know his main goal is to educate law enforcement on the challenges that are happening from a legal perspective, no matter what part it is, whether it's use of force or what we're talking about today, secondary employment. A few housekeeping rules. The webinar is being recorded, so everyone will get a link to the recording and the materials within a couple of days after the webinar, and you'll get an email on that as well. So that way you can share this with your friends or your coworkers if they're not able to attend. All users are muted, so there's a chat window over to the right. If you have questions or comments, we'll try to answer them as we can. And as you saw, we will be doing polls through this presentation. So I ask, as you see polls come up, we ask that you respond to them. I'm going to turn this over to Eric and let him get started. I'm going to, as he's doing his introduction, I'm actually going to pull up a poll real quick before you can see his great face via video. So here's the second part of that poll that we just asked. If you allow your employees to do it, so we'd like to know how you allow them to do it. So Eric, again, thank you for joining us today. We have over 400 registered people, and we have a large group that's joining us, so we're excited about this topic, which surprised me on a Friday. So you must know somebody, or you must be pretty important.
Well, no, I thank you, Tim. I appreciate, first, the opportunity to you, Andy and Ryan. We've discussed this, and yes, it was surprising to me, but that's a good thing because this seems to be a system that has kind of gone under the operational level of most police departments until it really becomes a problem. And so we're happy to present you. We know how valuable your time is on a Friday afternoon, or for those of you on the West Coast or somewhere in the middle of the morning. We appreciate your time, and as I always do, and I've had the opportunities to work with Power Details for a while. They've been a host of the Daigle Law Group Use of Force Summit in its inception, and its sister company, Power DMS. Most of you know that I'm a big fan of any part of technology that limits limits issues associated with legal liability. So, for example, one of the things that we all have to do, which especially is more difficult as we start to look at technology, because there's a lot of technology out there, but we evaluate at Daigle Law Group, we evaluate technology at all times because we're very clear in the liability sense of what happens with human nature and what happens when human nature is involved, and realistically all of the requirements that you are under in the professional aspect of this. Hello everybody, welcome, you got my face now. All the professional aspects that you're under require different areas for you to examine, and they can be completely overwhelming. And as a result of that, anytime that we can find a piece of software that can prevent liability, but while offering some guidance and oversight to allow you to spend more time on what you should be spending time on, and that is doing police work and protecting the communities that are there. So today we're going to talk about the legal issues on secondary employment. And honestly, I got to tell you, in a lot of departments where we have this discussion, because we have to have this discussion, because we've had labor rulings to go against a department or a liability issue that involves secondary employment, we're often faced with a lot of pushback. And this is something that people feel very strongly about. And I want to make sure we start and understand that I get it. I get the need to make more money. I myself started out with working the overnight shifts on the highway with the cruiser lights running as a way to pay my way through law school and buy my first house. So we are recognized that law enforcement has a secondary employment portion of this, but as you're going to see, there's a lot of inconsistencies in how we operate. So what we're going to do today is we're going to go over some of the basics, and then what I'd like to do is I'd like to make sure that we focus on some of the policy issues that I would recommend through here at Daigle Law Group and our policy center that we put in play, because we've already argued these, we've already fought those fights, and we'd like to have you as protected as we can be. Please, the ground rules, as Tim said, as we go through, is feel free to put some questions in the chat room if you want to. We're going to do some polls so that I can gauge your response and maybe adjust fire a little bit along the way. If you have a question, I will try to get to everybody's questions. If for some reason we can't get to everybody's questions in this time frame, we'll respond to you by email. And more importantly, if there is a question that we get to, but I don't know the answer to it, which is possible, because a lot of this is going to be labor law, we will get you the answer to the best of our ability. So understand portions when we talk about labor law, a lot of that is directly focused on your jurisdiction. So let's start with getting into the meat and potatoes here on a Friday afternoon.
And Eric, I wanted to show you the result. Hey, Eric, I wanted to show you the result of that question, so you saw that. I don't know if you saw that in the window.
Okay, so good. The important part of that is, so as you're going to see, 36%, 26%, 21%. I'm kind of interested in what the others are. So for those of you that are there that have answered other to that question, which is how is yours organized, I would be interested in you putting a little note in the chat window as to what you meant by other. So obviously we have an employee of the city or the municipality or the county, a 1099 subcontractor, or an employee of an outside private entity. And so I'm interested in what the others are if they do come up. All right, so let's jump into this. We're talking about secondary employment, and so for the purpose of being on the same page in this discussion, we're going to talk about private duty or off-duty work, the practice by which municipalities or agencies allow their sworn officers to moonlight as private security during off hours. Now, I always usually get a question right about here, so I'll make sure I answer it, and I'll ask Tim to facilitate this. We have a PDF version of this PowerPoint. We're going to make it available to you either here or in the after email that follows, so that you have this PowerPoint. So you don't have to scribble a bunch of notes, and you can just listen and pay attention. Hopefully have a good cup of coffee as you prepare for the weekend. So we're talking about moonlighting, private officers, private security during off hours. We know a couple of things if we look at the climate outside and around. We know, especially in the arenas of law enforcement, there is a demand for security services, and that demand is very high. I saw a stat while I was doing this research that there was a 600% increase in security services in the last 3 years. Obviously, I didn't dive down to make sure that's a viable number, but it seems reasonable to the fact that more and more security services are being requested. We know that municipalities have also used secondary employment, and when I use the word municipality today, please understand that it will mean whatever your entity is. So for my sheriff's organizations, the counties, for state police or highway patrol organizations, it could be the state or state agencies, and the municipalities or towns as they apply. Obviously, when there's secondary employment, the question is, are there administrative fees to pay for the people that organize them, for the vehicles, for the equipment, and what type of administrative fees are collected? So there is some income made by, or could be made by, the entity. And then the most important part of this, obviously, is the increase in the officer's income, the ability for the officer to work more time and increase their income, which is, in law enforcement, I fully understand it, and I'm okay with that. Starting out as a guy that understands the necessity of having to sit on the side of the highway for a while to make some extra money, or a special duty job, it is part of our way of life. So, but with that comes the things that we should be concerned about. And specifically, when we're talking about what is the scope of secondary employment, we're talking about officers that are generally allowed to wear their official uniforms They're going to carry weapons issued by them, by their departments, and their official uniforms might be some form of duty uniform or even a different type of uniform specifically for the jobs that they're entailing. We know that while they're in secondary employment, they maintain all the powers of an active on-duty police officer. Therefore, they can participate in search and seizures, they can make arrests, and they can use force, including the use of deadly force. We know that where this switches is that they are executing those powers partly under the direction of a private entity, which means they are working for another party. So those of us that, if you've done the research and you see the area where secondary employment has been attacked, it's been attacked on the aspect of, let's just call it what it is, it's renting a cop. And for renting out officers, many police departments earn considerable commissions for that in the process of renting out an officer. So we can have just some theory of what we're seeing out in the world. I did some research, and my team did some pulling of some media, and a couple of the topics that I used to guide my presentation today that we saw recently on the media look like this. There was a study out there, Rent-A-Cop, the big, shady, but legal business of secondary employment. Obviously, the effect of an outside employer directing a police officer in their daily in their application. Some news articles, which we see sometimes that look like this: officer arrested accused of double dipping, using their, while working in their duty details, they work either extra duty details, and therefore they have been paid twice for time which applies. Fake timesheets and the application of how this time is processed and governed and how it is recorded, whether this is off duty or just regularly, but we have seen across the country with, there's 900,000 police officers, 17,000 organizations. So, there's going to be these type of incidents which are obviously going to make news and attract attention. An interesting one I found here, which we'll discuss, is my backyard in Connecticut, which is unpaid extra duty bills going back to 2015, where the municipality had not collected payment for duty that they had paid out to the officers. So the system that they had in play did not allow for the department or the entity, the city, to receive payment, and therefore they were going in economic harm as a result of that. San Jose had an issue with officers working special duty or off-duty work with the 49ers, where it became to a point where the football players were calling officers, specifically in this news article showed where a football player who was involved in a domestic incident called the security officer to come to their house. The officer was on duty, came to the individual's house and intervened allegedly into the off-duty, into the incident, and as a result put this under scrutiny, the off-duty work by San Jose officers with the 49ers. In addition, we've seen headlines like at the top here, OPD, that's Orlando officers paid well above normal pay to work extra duty security details at local businesses. And we'll kind of get into that because Orlando, one of the organizations that has where they negotiate with the entity, with their client or with the business that's retaining them, and therefore without any guidance in negotiation, as the article alleged, that the officers could then include and increase the amount of money they received for doing the work. This one's a very interesting one, and those of you on the Power Details listserv, they put out an article on this. Poor officer in Tennessee. You can actually find this video on YouTube. While on duty, responds to a house to take a fireworks complaint from an individual, and while sitting at the table taking the complaint, the officer begins to fall asleep, and the homeowner takes out their camera, which we gotta love at all times, and begins to record that, and therefore that recording then makes it on YouTube, and the individual, the customer or the citizen felt so concerned about that they actually called the officer's supervisor turned out that the officer had worked significant amounts of off-duty conduct and they were sleeping or sleeping and tired. Another one where investigations and articles like this cause us some concern and disrepute in the media, and where officers are caught sleeping on duty. And the question in the regard is, well, why? And the fatigue that sets in. And majority of the time we find that a lot of these incidents are directly related to specific issues of working overtime and the amount of overtime in the days in a row that the officers had worked. And we're going to talk about this more in a liability sense, but also, you know, this is something near and dear to my heart in the use of force officer, the threat to officer situation, and that is fatigue and the application of fatigue. And while I fully understand the issues of making more money and feeding your family and paying your bills, there has to be some concern for what are the effects of fatigue on decision making, and we'll talk about that specifically as it relates to use of force incidents, especially in the case where there are deadly force incidents and its application. So that's some of the media that we've seen along the way, and as a result of looking at the media, we decided to put together some of the areas that we saw in the media aspect, and we wanted to address some certain topics today on behalf of Power Details, and we thank them for the opportunity to do this and the support that we get to ensure that your departments have the policies and the protections behind them. So the things that we're going to talk about today, as you see, organizational and operational issues with secondary employment. Labor decisions, and there's a lot of them. Usually most of the labor decisions specifically surround fairness and the distribution of jobs, workers' compensation, and legal issues. And that's really getting into the weeds a little bit, but for your attorneys in each of the industries, we have to be aware of indemnification issues, workers' compensation issues, and issues associated with coverage when something bad occurs and you're on the off-duty assignment, a secondary employment assignment. Who's responsible for the coverage? Use of force incidents, specifically equipment and fatigue. We'll talk a little bit about those areas. Internal affairs, the need for audits, the need for ensuring that policies are maintained and that there is no violations, for the end result of the reason why we have these policies and procedures to provide clear direction to the officers and to ensure that they fully understand what they can and cannot do. In an internal affairs application, it is as likely to get an internal affairs complaint from a secondary employment operation as it is from the shift work by the officers. And therefore, are your policies going to withstand the scrutiny by both the disciplinary side, and when the officer challenges the discipline, but also if it turns out to be a significant issue that goes to litigation. And then finally, the most, hopefully, which is the lowest portion of this, but there is a small percentage that we have to be concerned with, and that is corruption. The criminal acts that occur in the department. And very clearly, my overview to you will be, what have you done to ensure that corruption is not going to sneak up on you and cause you some problems in the future?
So Eric, before you move forward, two things. The answers when you asked about the other, since we couldn't answer multiple choices, a lot of departments are using all three ways of doing that. And then I wanted to ask the question before we move to the next slide. Let me launch this poll real quick and get your guys' response. Based off the feedback you just heard Eric talk about the areas we're going to cover, do you have a policy in place that governs what we discussed? If you can answer that real quick, we'll just give it a minute or two. But the responses, Eric, I got on the other again were all of the above, depends on the job. We do a mix of city paid and 1099, depends on the job. Poll only allowed for one answer, so I'll learn next time it would be multiple choice. And then looks like another PD says the university PD organizes that. So as
Okay.
those were the questions from before, but let me go ahead and show the poll results. Give me a second here, and I'll take you to those that are answering. So let me close the poll and show you the results.
And I can't see the chat unless I'm obviously doing something wrong, which is possible.
Now you should see the results from the poll.
Okay.
So
all right. So obviously, I'm
said
going
yes.
to be very. Oh, go ahead, Tim. I'm sorry.
87% said yes, they have policies in place that governs what you discussed.
All right. So what I want to do, if you can keep that poll up for a second, for those of you that fall into the 87% area, hopefully you're going to go through and do a checklist of the things that we're going to talk about today. We're going to make sure for the 87% group, we're going to make sure that they can, that they have, the policy is as complex and that they are. We're going to provide you some resources to check your policies on to make sure that they are in play. For the 13% that don't, this hopefully is going to be enough to motivate you to put some form of documentation together, and we'll start with that right now because that's the motivational portion of this. So really what I'm looking for, and those of you that have taken my training before know that my focus is always going to be on the same areas, and that is how to protect yourself and your agency. And we're going to start this off with common police practices. And like most policy and procedure acts, policy and procedure standards, they have to come from somewhere. Yes, a lot of smart people can write policies and procedures, but what I always say is that we want to look at things that have been under some form of scrutiny. So I'm going to provide you some of that guidance today on what you can look at and what I would consider to be common police practices in the industry so that you can do a check of your system. More importantly, the documents that I'm going to refer to today are documents that plaintiffs' attorneys can look to when asking you questions. Now, I will tell you, usually except for labor issues where there's a fairness as to how much distribution and how distribution occurred, this type of secondary employment becomes a secondary issue to an already a bigger issue. So it's a secondary issue to a deadly force shooting. It's a secondary issue to a false arrest claim that was made while off duty. All of these things are usually secondary, and therefore we still have some time to make sure that we can identify some of the key areas. And for me, as you see on the board, one of the things is, why are we doing this and why do we do it this way? Do you know the reason for that? And is there someone that's going to be able to testify as to why you've decided to do it this way and put this structure in play? And more importantly, is there consistency? I know I sound like a broken record, but I'm always concerned with inconsistent conduct within a police department. And a lot of times with special duties, secondary employment jobs, there is a lot of inconsistency, and we always lose when there's inconsistency. So the reason why we like the policies is to ensure that we can control some of that. Just to put it in perspective for you, and a lot of you have seen this before because it's my favorite diagram, and I give thanks to Charlie Reynolds who helped me put this to its application, but we're always looking at protecting the constitutional policing of a police department. So obviously we know that means do the right thing at the right time for the right reason, but we're also going to break it down into the three areas that apply, which is policy. Do you have an effective operational policy? Have you trained your department on that policy? And have you sat down with your department and told them this is what you can do, this is what you can't do? And obviously you can do that by using the systems that are available. We all use Power DMS because of its application, but therefore you can ensure that their policy has been viewed and protects from liability with the fact that officers can't say, I didn't see that. But then most importantly, which we will talk about today, is the supervision, the oversight of these jobs and the manner in which the policy has some guidance in this process. And supervision is something that we want to focus on because the auditing and the assessment in this is going to prevent a lot of the headaches along the way. All right, Well, there's got to be a
Can I
reason
make a,
why.
let me make a comment to that real quick, Eric, on that.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
you asked the question about inconsistency is one of the issues, and supervision and beyond the audit stuff. What I want to do is just pull up this question real quick, because I think, as you see, most people have an off-duty or secondary employment details, and one of the things we here at Power Details, when we talk to clients about why they're looking for a system outside of an Excel spreadsheet or via email and phone, is because when a risk issue happens, and you know this from your side of the house, you need to be able to prove that something happened. So the question that I have up there is, in your department, if you have the capability so that if I came to you or Eric came to you and you were his client and said, hey, I need you to run a report for Officer X and how many times he worked at ABC Company in a month. And the reason that's important is because I think Eric will agree with me is that it's not the incident that usually is the issue, it's the operational side that the inconsistencies show, right? And that's where Power Details really comes into play with the platform. So let me show you the results of this, because I think this is pretty interesting based off the poll. Let me close this and show you this. Another minute or two for a few more people to answer. Close.
And I will tell you, Tim, while you're putting that together, this is such an important issue. I just recently represented the 2 officers that are on a deadly force incident, and one of my first questions when I meet with the officers is, you know, how many hours did you work the day before? Did you work overtime? How many hours did you work this week? And it's not because that is an effect on the officer's use of deadly force, but I know that that is going to become an issue and a challenge by prosecutors, and maybe even by, or definitely by plaintiff's attorneys when the lawsuit comes. They're going to try and imply that the city was deliberately indifferent, or the municipality or the agency was deliberately indifferent in allowing the officer to work so many hours, and what effect did that have on their decision making.
Yeah, so you can see that 54% out of the entire group that's on, which is a large community, wouldn't very easily be able to pull this up. And this is one of the things you've got to think about when you're having a program, because it's great to get the overtime, but as soon as you have a use of force or some other incident, and in the lawsuit they're asking to show, do you have off-duty details of secondary employment, be able to show that quickly. So thank you for answering it. Let me hide this and get you back to on track.
Okay, and to go right onto that point and what I talked about, and thank you, Tim, is focusing on the reason why. And those of you that have been to enough of my training programs, you're going to see this over and over and over and over again, because I continue to talk about Monell versus Department of Social Services, because it's the reason why I have a job. And that is, my job is to prevent the Powerball, not the issue itself from the incident alleged, but the failure of the agency to address it. So we know that that's guided by Monell versus Department of Social Services. It is a 1978 Supreme Court case in which the court held that Section 1983 applies to municipalities and local governmental units when policies or official procedure are responsible for a violation of federally protected rights. Now, it's not as straightforward in a secondary employment as it is with a use of force, as it is with a false arrest claim or an illegal search and seizure, but it still applies in the aspect of failure of policy, failure to supervise, failure to investigate, and failure to train. There's a 2-part test which you have to keep in mind, and that is the existence of an official policy or custom of such long standing to have the force of law, which is, as we say from this is the way we do it here, and one or more of the municipal employees violated the plaintiff's civil rights. So if the system is leading to a problem, or what we call in the industry a pattern or practice of abuse, then that's where the connection will be made. As always, we're trying to prevent what we call deliberate indifference, and that is, what did we know, how did we know it, and what did we do about it? Is the inadequacy so obvious or so likely to result in a violation of constitutional rights that the policymakers can reasonably be said to have been deliberately indifferent? Do you know that there is favoritism in the distribution of jobs? Do you know that there is abuse of the system in which officers are double dipping, or they're negotiating unfairly with the clients, or is there some form of even the worst area, which is corruption and criminal application? What did you do about it? And wanting to protect many of you, we're going to deal with that. So we know that many police departments allow officers to work outside jobs, and a well-functioning department should have a checks and balances in place to ensure that the outside employment does not undermine the police mission or officer accountability. And the question I'm going to ask you right now to do some self-analysis is, does your department have an accountability mechanism? Do they have an inspection team? Is there somebody overlooking the data that's coming out of this on a weekly, monthly, quarterly basis? And it's going to be very inconsistent across the country. So I'm going to focus on policy, supervision, and audits. So let's talk about the organizational and operational issue. First of all, as an entity, how do you control off-duty conduct? And there's a couple points here that I want you to consider in this. And the things that I want you to consider are the very basics aspect of what is the municipality's protection? What is the officer safety issues that apply? How about your overtime labor costs? How about increased insurance costs for workers' compensation and liability? How about a uniform officer is clearly representing a municipality? They're in the community's eye, and so what are the guidance that you have? And as we know, from the poll question that Tim put up in the beginning, we're going to start out by separating it into these three entities. There are really three categories which we're paying attention to, and that is city employment or town employment, meaning everything goes through an entity. The officers don't negotiate. They don't have any oversight except you're being assigned this, go and do it. And that is the purpose behind Power Details. The assignment of that is one portion of what that allows. How does assignments get assigned and distributed? We'll talk about that. Second area, which is, I think, one of the most difficult areas in the law issue, and that is, are your officers contracted by the secondary employer and paid on a 1099 subcontractor basis? And there's subcontracting, the arena of subcontractors is a very difficult one to begin with. But now adding the law enforcement entity into that with insurance and subcontractor status, we're going to see a lot of questions come from number two. Number three is where some police officers actually become an employee of the secondary employer. Now, in the liability arena, I think 1 in 3 offers the most protection because it's very clear cut. You're either in or you're out. In both of those, 1, you're in, 3, you're out, 2, you're on the fence. And there's going to be a lot of questions to guide how that occurs. So let's look at what we should have in your policy. Let's start with that.
Hey, Eric,
according to the Bureau, yes, sir.
Hey, Eric, let me ask a quick question, because based off of those three things, and let me ask this whole question real quick, because I think for you to understand, you asked them that they have to control these things and how it's done. So if you can look at, how do you manage that today? Can paper, email, and phone, Excel, a homegrown system, or other software programs? That's really important, because as you're going from a legal perspective and understanding what's going on, is having the ability to get that quickly to whether it's Eric or another attorney. So give me just a second as I'm pulling out.
We got to get you one of those little things to raise your hand, Tim.
Well, I can raise my hand, but you're not going to see it. Maybe I should just come on the video and raise my hand so you can see me.
Yeah, but then you would have to not be in your shorts and a T-shirt down there in sunny Florida. Isn't that correct?
I'm actually in a suit, but I can't show you. My camera's not on at the moment, so that's good. Okay, let me give the answer to this, because I think this is very good. Because let me close this out. Thank you for those who responded. So let me close this and show you the results. So those are the results, Eric, from how they're managing it.
Paper and pen is still concerning. Those of you that are starting to find yourself in categories, what's that?
Mm-hmm. No, the top 4 are all basically homegrown, Excel, or paper and pen.
Those of you that are in the top 4 and that also answered no to the policy question before, hopefully you're starting to see some of the concerns.
Eric, back to you. Sorry about that.
All right. No problem. You like to mess up my flow. That's okay. I'm good with that, though. All right. So the questions we're going to talk about is, we know that Bureau of Justice Statistics says 83% of all the nation's police departments have a written policy for secondary employment. So the question to you is, do you have a policy? And let's talk about some of the things that I'm going to look for in the policy. First and foremost, the policy should regulate situations and locations within which a sworn member is permitted to make an arrest while off duty. There has to be some guidance, especially as for an officer safety issue, if the officer is working a plain clothes for some unknown reason, or working in another area where there's, we definitely want to try and prevent a blue on blue issue, and we want to address issues in which their officers are not doing what they're supposed to be doing or don't have the proper backup, but we have to regulate those situations. We're usually going to start a policy out with talking about the eligibility to participate in the secondary employment area, meaning have they completed their training and have they completed their probation. So most departments will, and I would say it's a recommendation that they should be completing their probationary period before they're allowed to work secondary employment. Let's make sure they know how to do their primary job before we give them access to doing a secondary job, which is going to increase their fatigue, their areas, and their learning curve in this application. Also, we've seen a lot of case law, and you will find this on the AELE website. Americans for Effective Law Enforcement will be at the end of the resource page, will be at the end of this presentation. How about officers? Does your policy spell out for officers that are on sick leave, disability of some form, military leave, they're on limited duty, or they're on an FMLA status? And if they are on any form of leave from the department, they should be ineligible to participate in a secondary employment application. There is some labor case law out there, and there might be some unique cases where there might be the other side of the coin where it's been allowed. But pretty much my research showed that if there was a policy in place that said they couldn't do it and they were on this type of leave, that they were not allowed to do it. So when they were found to be working, then they could be disciplined for it, for the prevention of they weren't actually working in the capacity as a police officer at that time. There has to be some process for permission, meaning how are we going to address the permission aspect of this? How are we going to approval of secondary employment, and who's going to make that approval? Apologize. If I knew how to shut that ringer off, I would, but I don't. Okay, so in the responsibility section, one of the things that we're going to look at is some prohibitions. And you may look at some of these prohibitions and say, Eric, come on, do I really need to put this stuff in my policy? And I'm going to look at you and say, yes, you really need to put it in your policy. Yes, I hope and I pray that common sense is still an actual application in law enforcement, but unfortunately with a large caseload and many attorneys across the country with a large caseload, we have to kind of take common sense for granted and put that in there. So there has to be a prohibition, or should be a prohibition, from working secondary employment while on duty. There should be a limitation of hours per day and per week that the officers can work. And again, that's the need for software. That's one of the benefits of Power Details. And what I like about their system is we can track the hours per day, hours per week of the officers, and put some protections in place to ensure that we are aware if that goes over for the deliberate and different aspects. Duty to report off-duty and secondary employment. I mean, you just can't go do it. You have to be on duty. You have to report that you're doing it, so supervision and the department have some knowledge. There has to be proper supervision oversight. We'll talk about auditing and going out to the scene and make sure everybody has their necessary equipment and doing what they're supposed to be doing. We know that there's a lot of media attention when we get a lot of pictures of officers on their phones, in their cars, sleeping, relaxing while working overtime. Well, listen, they're tired, I get it, but we also have to pay attention, and on the command aspect of this, of what are they taking appropriate action. There has to be a duty to take appropriate law enforcement action, meaning that their number one job is a police officer. They have a duty to enforce the law, and they have to be clear that they understand that duty and that duty must come before all over. One of my favorites here, and I want to spend a second on this, is duty duty to be properly equipped. Radio, weapon, non-deadly alternative. A lot of times I cringe as I drive, especially through the streets of Connecticut or all over the country, see off-duty officers with a gun tucked in their pants or a pancake holster, no radio visible, no equipment, no duty belt on. And I understand the issues associated with it. It's heavy, it's bulky, it's taxing on the body. The difficulty is, especially in use of force arena, there are multiple cases across the country in which we know that there is an obligation to have an officer to have non-deadly force alternatives on their person at all times. And what does that mean? That means, well, if you just have a pancake holster and you're thrown smack in the middle of an incident, your only weapons you have available to you are the firearm. That's going to be a significant problem, and that's something which we're going to address along the way. But you need to be aware of it. I know I don't become a fan of officers when I say, if I had it my way, you'd have your duty belt on. Why? Because you have all your tools with you, and therefore you have options when the situations quickly escalate and you are forced to be thrown in the middle of that situation. There's plenty of litigation out there for detectives and for individuals driving to and from work getting involved in use of force incidents and not having the available non-deadly alternative to them. So something I strongly recommend that agencies put in play as a protection for the officers, because the underlying threshold is just this. You use what you have available to you. If you don't have it available to you, it's not an option, and therefore there has to be some protection in play. Responsibilities. The part of the policy dealing with responsibilities, we're going to look for periodic inspections by supervisors. We're going to look that officers are in policy should not solicit off-duty work while on duty. They should not disclose confidential information. They should not use on-duty time to take other law enforcement action on behalf of their off-duty employer. And one of the things that we're going to talk about when we talk about New Orleans is the issue, do you have guidance in your policy that dictates that sergeants and above shall not engage in law enforcement secondary employment that is coordinated, brokered, supervised, or scheduled by an employee of a lower rank in the supervisor's direct chain of command. The problems with that are hopefully self-evident to you, and that is if the supervisor is now more in debt to the officer because the supervisor is more worried about his overtime work than actually supervising the employee. And that's something that has become a significant problem across the country. Prohibitions that we want to see in a policy as it applies is, sorry, wrong slide. There you go. Prohibitions, performing tasks other than those of a law enforcement nature while in police uniform. Obviously, we'll do anything that they'll pay us for, so let's be concerned with that. Professional sporting events, the risk of serious injury to officers who are working in the area of professional sporting events. Repossessing or towing cars, can't do it. Process server, can't do it. Bill collector, can't do it. Employment which requires access to police info. A lot of times private investigation applications. And there, believe it or not, there's actually even case law across the country with agencies who, or states that the law has said the officers cannot work as lawyers in the jurisdiction in which they are employed. We definitely could argue and make sure that the policy says that officers aren't allowed to assist in case preparation for defense of criminal actions. And you could probably much assume the sell or dispensing of intoxicating beverages, and more now as we're seeing, especially in states where marijuana is becoming both in the medical area and now legal, the use of off-duty officers in the marijuana industry is becoming a prohibited action across the country based on the confliction, especially between federal and state law, and the concerns for corruption that are currently facing us that may correct itself over a period of time. As we look at the first area we're going to look at is labor decisions. And in looking at labor decisions, one of the things that is clear is that a lot of times the collective bargaining agreement it deals with what can occur and what's already been negotiated for employment, so secondary employment. So obviously, for the protection of the labor agreement, the collective bargaining agreement, please take a look at that. The biggest issue in labor is how complaints are distributed. Are they fair? A recent case that came out of Seattle, and you can just Google it yourself, is a $2.8 million verdict against Seattle Police Chief regarding the alleged retaliation of officers and transferring. I'm sure that this is going to be appealed, but it is out there for you to look at, in which a veteran police sergeant filed a lawsuit against the city of Seattle, alleging that she was the target of retaliation after she complained about a lucrative overtime pay. Basically that 4 officers who were in favor of an assistant chief were being improperly steered overtime work. It was not open to all, and it was an alleged blatant unfairness in this situation, at least the way that the plaintiff's complaint relayed. It was an allegation of a discriminatory process that stopped the special treatment, which means that once she complained, the treatment stopped. Once she complained, the fairness issue was stopped, and then retaliation occurred because she complained about it, and people were transferred and lost their positions, and therefore that's the basis of the lawsuit that occurred. Again, areas like this are the areas that we're talking about in the labor arena. Risk factors.
Let me make a quick comment, Eric. Sorry. What I wanted to say is on that piece with Ryan and Andy, as we're out talking to clients over the hundreds that we have, we've literally got quotes from clients that said, one quote that I'll never forget was, there were 2 sergeants who got into a fist fight over off-duty processes because it wasn't fair, and that's why they decided they needed a system, and they moved to power detail. So that's probably the number one thing we hear, and within the platform, you're able to set those limitations and make fairness based off seniority or about how much the payments they're making off of the deal. So it's a big issue and something that gets solved with certain technologies.
And a lot of that, Tim, you guys are actually right. I mean, that's stemmed on how technology can solve us some of the very simple grievances and labor issues that occur, and that makes up a large portion of the issues associated with secondary employment. That's one of the reasons why I'm such a big fan of this system, in the aspect of that it takes human nature out of the ballpark. It takes human nature out of the game, and that's what I'm a big fan of. All right, so let's transition to 1099 employees. And I always get very uncomfortable when I talk about the 1099 employees because, boy, they're very protective of this issues, but we have to really focus on the risk factors that are associated. And the type of risk factors that I'm going to look at is the workers' compensation. Who's going to pay when they get injured, and who's going to pay when they get sued? More importantly, who assumes liability for the officer? What if he slips, trips, falls, injures himself, and unfortunately, gets struck by a vehicle? What if the municipality is sued due to the employee's activities while in secondary employment? Who's going to handle the large costs associated with the medical treatment and the litigation as it applies? We know that in the area of 1099 employees that some municipalities allow their employees to moonlight freely and consider that they should be an independent contractor to the secondary employer, working for that employer as a 1099 employee. I got to tell you, in the litigation arena, this is a scary entity. It is an entity which and if you're in this area, the best thing that I can show you will be coming up soon in the review of New Orleans Police Department. You really have to look at what Department of Justice found. I know that New Orleans is not the only entity. There's been plenty of places I've been in which these issues have been clear. And when you ask the questions, everybody just kind of looks away and goes, well, we're not going to talk about that. And I understand that. So when we're focusing on 1099 employees, the thing I'm going to focus on is if the police officer is injured while moonlighting, generally the law says he will not be covered by workers' compensation unless the officer is acting under color of law. Great question, because your question should be is, what does that mean? It really means that at some point, we're going to go back and forth from employee to subcontractor, and now there's a lot of things to talk about. There's a lot of discretion in that way that looks. So that's where the policy is necessary. Basically, the recommendation is that in that case, the secondary employment ends the instant the officer changes from acting as a security guard. For example, he has assumed his or her police powers. So as soon as he goes from acting in one being the traffic detail officer, the security officer, to now enforcing his police powers, and as you can imagine, as I'm saying this, you're probably sitting there going, wow, that doesn't just flip over black and white. There's a lot of indiscretion in that application. If the police officer effects an arrest for shoplifting while working as security guard, then his role changes as well as his employer. He is now reverted to being the municipality's employee. So one of the documents that I read said, and this is how they broke it down, when he's acting in the store as a security officer, he is working secondary employment. When he sees the theft and arrests the individual for the theft, he is no longer a secondary employee. He is now again under color of law, utilizing his authority rights given to him by his department. Again, there's obviously some concerns in there. Most of what I found also was that if the officer, while has a 1099 status, if the officer slips, trips, falls, is injured, that the officer is not covered by you, which meaning the agency or the secondary employer, he would have to rely on his own personal health insurance. Well, guess what? That's probably not clear to officers. And more importantly, for some officers who are so deeply involved in this secondary duty, I would probably recommend that they go and they get their own insurance coverage, because that's going to be the case. We found an interesting case.
Before we go to the next point, we got one more poll, or a couple more polls, but here's another one I want to just ask real quick. I think this is really important because I got some questions on this.
Okay.
So if you can answer that poll real quick, that'd be great.
No, I have a full suit on. Nice, I appreciate that.
Let me close the poll. Thank you for those.
That must be your Air Force mentality.
I'm sorry, there he is. So 58% believe that you are wearing shorts, not to make light of that, but I'll let you move forward.
Can I get back to some serious stuff? You're infecting my time here.
All you.
All right. We found a great case, because I'm going to be probably a little bit over, but I'll try and rush through the last part. We found an interesting case which you thought would be interesting. City of Balch Springs, Texas. There was a fatal motor vehicle accident involving an off-duty officer who was driving a city vehicle at his secondary employment part-time security job for Walmart. And so basically, this officer falls into category number 3. He was employed by Walmart as a security officer. And but the municipality allowed the officers to take a police cruiser and park it at Walmart while they were working at that job. So the officer goes to work and the cruiser is not there. Goes to work at Walmart. The cruiser is not there. Tells his employer, I'm going to go to the police department and get the cruiser. Goes to the police department, picks up the cruiser, driving it back, and gets involved in a fatal motor vehicle accident where he runs over an individual driving a tractor in the street.
Oh, okay.
You have a question? Oh, did I lose somebody? Nope. All right, so there was driving a tractor and he gets run over. The officer was armed, wearing a city police uniform, wearing his police badge, and the reason why this is so significant was because this guy was fully employed by Walmart, and what the court said was, it is a well-established principle that merely because an employee is on duty or on call 24 hours a day does not mean that the person is always acting within the scope of his employment. The performance for a governmental unit of the duties of an employee's office or employment, and includes being in and about the performance of a task lawfully assigned to an employee by competent authority. In general, the court said, whether a person is acting within the scope of his employment depends on whether the general act from which an injury arose was in furtherance of the employer's business and for the accomplishment of the objective for which the employee was employed. In short, an employee is not acting within the scope of his duties unless the activity has some connection with and is being undertaken in furtherance of the employer's business. In determining whether the police officer is acting within the scope of his employment, it is necessary to consider whether the officer is discharging a duty. Oh, wait a minute, I did that already. So you got it twice. How's that? So the question, as it looked here, was the court went back and said, at the time of the accident, the officer was returning to his place of off-duty private employment. He was not operating in his capacity as a city police officer during his return travel, his off-duty job site at Walmart. Because the police officer is in a patrol car does not necessarily mean the officer is on duty. And I think that this was a ruling, I just want you to keep in the back of your mind that this was a ruling that came out of Texas. I don't know that I would get the same ruling out of the East Coast or the Northwest Coast in its application. The court came back and actually said the cruiser was a deterrent, but not required by the police agency. And therefore, the court found that there was a lack of subject matter jurisdiction in this application. So with the last couple of minutes.
We had a question real quick because it's pertinent to what you were talking about. The question is, should police officers from a municipality who are hired as officers to work overtime events for a university be sworn in by the university police department in order to be guaranteed the officers are working for the university when working university overtime events?
I missed it. What's the scope?
Basically, this is a third-party police department that's providing support to a university police department. He's asking, should they be sworn officers of the university police department as well from an off-duty perspective so that when they're working overtime,
I got it
something
now.
happens?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that, especially in a university setting, which also has its issues associated with liability, if you're working there, depending on obviously what jurisdiction you're from and where the state this is in, I would like to see the officers cross-sworn. That way, then when they act in because remember, you always have to be someone. You either are a civilian or you're an officer. And if you don't have jurisdiction to take action against the individual conducting a criminal act, meaning that it might not be a felony, and therefore, if you're not a sworn officer in the jurisdiction, you may not have the legal authority to act, and therefore you're acting as a citizen, as a civilian under a citizen type of law that allows you to do so. And therefore, it would be much easier and cleaner if the individual was cross-sworn. Any other questions there, Tim?
No, that was it. Go ahead. I know I have one more poll question before we leave, but I'm going to go a little over. I think we'll be all right for those of you that have to leave.
Well, what we're going to do is, what we're going to do is, I have about 10 slides just to talk about the New Orleans Police Department, and we may have to do a separate webinar just on this one. I didn't know how quick that was going to go through, but I'm going to leave the slides in here just for your review. And basically not to pick on New Orleans because they have done a great job in addressing these issues, but I'm going to strongly recommend that you take a look at the Department of Justice findings letter for New Orleans Police Department. They were a 1099 agency, and some of the stuff that they found in the investigation, which you can read through all of it and you will see, the report basically called the NOPD's paid detail unit an orchestra of corruption and maintained that its loose structure undermined the quality of the NOPD policing, facilitated abuses, contributed to officer fatigue and inequitable policing, and acted as a financial drain on the department. And what I will show you here just quickly as we go through these next handful of slides is that a few aspects of the NOPD system were troubling, such as the quality of NOPD policing, the facilitated abuse and corruption, the compromising an officer and the fatigue associated with compromising the officers, the inadequacy of the policing, You saying something? He acts as a financial drain. Go ahead.
I was not. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. So the one thing NOPD did right away, which I would strongly recommend, is, and they did this right away in this analysis, is they banned cash payments. Somewhere written in some aspect of some policy within your agency, every police department needs the verbiage that says officers are not allowed to receive cash payments for any work conducted. So please, at the very minimum, if you're a 1099 or other category, that you do not get cash payments for this. That's kind of the reason why we like the system of Power Details, that it goes through an actual billing and money never touches a police officer's hand. The problem in the 1099 arena is that officers are still negotiating their compensation, and they found some ridiculous negotiations, such as, you know, professional sports athletes and high celebrities were paying officers as much as $500-600 a night for private security details, and that has obviously some concern. Look at what occurred in NOPD on the negative impacts of the quality of policing. One of the things they found was that they believed that the detail system contributed to poor policing, that officers were more committed to their details than they were for working for the police department. And there was actually cases alleged in which officers were called ghosting, where the officer showed up for roll call, then left and went to his detail rather to his assignment at NOPD. Some of the concerns that we saw in this area and the negative impact have to do with poor documentation, no restrictions on the officers soliciting work, the officers being allowed to negotiate, and it became an easy target for extorting businesses and individuals. Hey, if you don't pay us this much money, then you're never going to get a cop when you call us. That's just the way it's going to go. When that unfolds, if it does occur, and hopefully it's very limited, even it should not occur at all, but when it does and it's caught, it really blows up quickly. And the complaint system, which is when somebody wants to file an internal complaint about somebody working a detail, where do they call? For example, and they talked about officers working in the Superdome, and that is when somebody wanted to file a complaint against the officer in this professional football stadium, who did they call? And well, if they told the stadium security, it never made its way to NOPD for analysis. One of the other things that they talked about in this I thought was very interesting, especially since community policing is a big part of us. They said that that certain parts of New Orleans were getting better police coverage than other because of off-duty employment, that people with means had the ability to pay for police protection, and therefore there were more cops in areas of the city where people had the means to pay for that protection, and there was not cops in areas where regular patrol was working. Officer fatigue, we talked about that, the ability to track hours and time, too tired to perform their duties on the street.
Let me ask a quick question. I'm gonna launch a poll. I've got 2 polls left, but I'm gonna launch this that's based off of what you're talking about. So let me just launch that real quick, just to see if there's an interest for us to do another webinar that's more in depth of going over New Orleans, just as a lessons learned. So if you can answer that poll. There was a question: is there any legal basis for limiting the number of hours an officer can work off duty, or total number of hours an officer can work per week with duty and off duty? So I think you were getting into that issue, but they were asking if there's a legal basis for that, limiting the amount of hours.
I mean, the legal basis is that, there is court cases out there. You will find them on the link for Americans for Effective Law Enforcement. Unfortunately, it's a little different than like tactical operations, where now I can say, hey, you need this much hours of training. For pretty much, I found that the consistency was 16 to 18 hours a day, no more than that. I mean, they got to sleep at some point. And that there were areas where officers were allowed to, I saw numbers ranging from 28 to 36 hours extra duty a week, depending on how your schedule works. I would research the area. I think the most number I saw was 36 hours on top of your 40-hour schedule. Obviously, that might be different if you're working 12-hour shifts and how your rest days go. But that's something of concern. Is there a legal precedent? Yes, you have to control areas of liability, and an officer who is fatigued, an officer who can't perform their duties, and especially in the area of decision making and use of force, we have an obligation to make sure our officers are legally meeting the standards of not working more than 18 hours a day. And I think that's as far as you're going to get. I mean, that's only leaves you 6 hours for life, and with only a couple hours of sleep.
I got another question. I allow my officers to work construction traffic details only for a neighboring municipality that sometimes cannot staff all their jobs. What are the legal ramifications, if any? So basically,
the legal ramifications. Yeah, well, I would, in a lot of, for whoever said that, I will tell you, we're seeing a lot of that across the country. You know, that's basically the expansion of regionalization. The one thing that I would suggest for the protection when you're allowing your officers to go into other jurisdictions to work secondary employment is that you have a memorandum of understanding with that agency as to who's responsible, because I want you to clearly understand this issue. When you send your officer into another jurisdiction, if that officer participates in any conduct that is involved in an internal affairs or a civil litigation, that is coming back to you. So you are going to get to foot the bill for that. And therefore, the two things we talked about, memorandums of understanding, and more importantly, maybe even cross-swearing if the jurisdictional lines are there. You know, a lot of times we see that with regional tactical teams, regional accident reconstruction teams, regional investigative teams, narcotics, for the purposes of protecting the liability of those officers. Depending on how much you're doing, you should definitely be doing more of that.
Okay, and follow up to that regarding the current question, with a non-emergency mutual aid agreement cover that for the department, or should we still have an MOU?
It matters how much you're doing it. If it's just an every once in a while, and you know, there is good language. Some states have not really good language on mutual aid, and so, you know, your legal oversight should take a look at that and make sure that how solidified that law is. But more importantly, if especially with the areas of, it's basically frequency, you know, risk management aspect, meaning if what you're doing is occurring at a very frequent rate, then don't even risk it. Do a memorandum of understanding so that everybody's on the same page, and that it'll be cleaner in the liability process based on the frequency. Any other questions there, Tim? Did I lose Tim along the way?
If you have any other questions, feel free to ask them. There's no other questions at the moment. I'm just going to put up a poll, and I know we're over on time, but this is recorded. I just want to say thank you to Eric for your time and energy on this. Thanks for all those on a Friday who attended this. You know, we're committed to other educational sessions specific to secondary employment. So based off of what I saw, it looks like we're going to do another webinar regarding maybe a dissection of the New Orleans incident. And if there's anything else you'd like to see, please either comment or email us as we grow our webinar series. We had one a couple weeks back that's on our website about, we had one of our clients talk about how they use the system and how it's helped them and the hours it's saved. We're trying to build an education series. Eric, thank you as always. There's a couple more questions I'm going to ask and leave the poll up for now. Should an agency be forced to have its officers wear body cameras even when secondary employment is not scheduled through the agency?
Well, it matters what your body camera. I'm a big fan of body-worn cameras. It's kind of like a piece of equipment, just like your firearm and you're having available non-deadly force. You never know when that bad incident's going to occur, or when your officer is going to get thrown into a situation that they have to deal with. Your body-worn camera policy should specifically address when an officer is required to turn their camera on, and usually it's, you know, some form of community interaction or law enforcement application, and therefore when doing that, we want to make sure that I would say that if the officer is working in a law enforcement uniform, in a law enforcement capacity, especially if they are in Category 1, which means they are working for the entity, if that is the case, then their body-worn camera should be available to them to record that situation. I mean, we all know how many times somebody just pulls up and everything goes to hell quickly and the officer has to respond or react, or how many times on an overtime job, a special duty job where a criminal act occurs that the officer has to get involved in as a backup to the patrol in that area. So I think it is smart risk management that if you are a body-worn camera department, that you continue to use that system. Now, obviously, the problem is going to be is if you're working a double shift, the battery life on that camera probably is not going to last. But I do think you should make it available.
Now, that looks like that was, unless you have more questions, please ask. And it amazes me as hell the importance of this topic, because we had pretty much a 100% participation, even with the overage of time. So I think if you think of any other issues or things you'd like to learn about from off-duty secondary employment, please email us or let us know so we can combine that into another webinar series. Eric, any last comments or anything on your side?
No, Tim, Andy, and Ryan, I thank you for the opportunity. On behalf of all law enforcement, I thank Power Details for being more concerned about not just selling their product, but also being concerned that the agencies are being protected and offering to their clients the ability to share that. And I think that's a significant portion of what is successful here, is that what you're coming away from with this webinar is more than, hey, this is a great piece of equipment that will prevent some of your liability. I'm hoping you're also coming away with, if you choose not to do anything else, at least you'll have some basis to review your policies and the structures that's there. So on behalf of the law enforcement side, I will thank you, Tim, and Andy, and Ryan for that opportunity.
No, you're quite welcome. We thank all those that are joining in law enforcement for what you do on a daily basis. This is recorded, so we will be getting a recording out. You'll get an email from us and probably from Eric as a follow-up as well, so you have access to the recording. Thank you again. Have a great Friday. It's officially afternoon unless you're in Hawaii. It's still morning. But other than that, Eric, have a great day. Eric, I'll call you later. And all those that joined, thank you, and have a great Friday and a great weekend.
Thank you. Be safe, everybody.